Ruwaysat Ridge in Egypt rises like a long brown whaleback out of the sea of rocks that lie some 10 miles south of El Alamein and 20 miles north of the great sand sea known as the Qattara Depression. Had you been standing here in the summer of 1942, you'd have been standing more or less in the central point of the British forces' defensive positions. Here, they would make their final stand against Rommel's Afrika Korps in the battle that would be the turning point of the war in North Africa, El Alamein. 1942 began with America now in the war, following the Japanese attack 3 weeks earlier on the US Pacific Fleet in its port at Pearl Harbor.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Now, Britain and her Commonwealth allies would no longer have to fight the war on their own. With America's industrial might turned to war production, the tide would surely turn. For Winston Churchill, it was, in some sense, vindication of his determination to hang on to North Africa.
It's an interesting comparison there between the attitude the British took when they started to resupply North Africa in 1941, at a time when we were under threat, we felt, from German invasion and couldn't spare anything. And yet Churchill had the vision to say, no, we must hold North Africa because we need to retain the Suez Canal and the Red Sea in the event the Americans become involved, and we would wish them to use that. And that was his reason for staying there very largely. And so therefore he was prepared to divert those resources.
Operation Crusader had gone well for the British and Commonwealth forces. The besieged garrison in Tobruk had been relieved the previous November, and the Afrika Korps and its Italian allies driven all the way back to El Agheila, whence they had started almost a year before. The British commanders began preparing for the next phase, the attack to drive the Axis forces out of Tripolitania for good. It was thought that Rommel was in no fit state to respond, but Rommel's armour had not been destroyed, and large numbers of reinforcements were arriving in Tripoli. On the 21st of January, Rommel attacked. British armour outnumbered the Axis forces by almost 2 to 1, but the Afrika Korps gained complete surprise. The British were easily defeated and chased from the battlefield in total disarray. On the 27th, the Axis forces attacked Benghazi. A mixed Italian and German force attacked from the coast road, while Rommel led another force through the hills to the southwest of the port. His attack was completely unexpected, and Benghazi fell. The loss of Benghazi was a severe blow to morale, as once again British troops were forced to flee eastwards. They coined their own laconic description of this seemingly endless ebb and flow, the Benghazi Stakes. At Gazala, Rommel halted in the face of the British defences that had been drawn up in the previous months.
We were in Tobruk for quite a long while. We were rearranging the mines out on the Gazala front. We did odd jobs around the harbour. We were getting fairly heavily bombed. And so much so that we moved out on the perimeter near Gazala and worked from there. The basic thing we were doing, somebody decided when they laid minefields, they would lay them in a pattern. One there, one there, one there, one there, and one in the middle. No matter which way Jerry came, if he missed that one, he's bound to hit the one in the middle. They didn't take into account when Jerry started to clear our minefields. It didn't take him long to realise, well, that's funny, we found one 2 paces back there. Well, they've laid them to a pattern. And that made life a lot easier for them. So then they decided that we went out there and we were sort of just untangling the pattern, making it more difficult for them.
The defensive system consisted of a series of loosely held locations, or boxes as they were called. Each box was held by infantry, artillery and anti-tank guns, but were spaced so that armoured units could manoeuvre easily between them to provide support where needed. Unfortunately, the boxes were too far apart and communications between them soon broke down. Rommel was giving the British a masterclass in mobile warfare.
Let's go back to those early operations around the Italian forts in 1941. It's actually quite easy to drive around a fort that's standing still. That doesn't mean you've adopted all the concepts of mobile warfare and the requirement that comes with it for a proper all-arms structure, integrated, working together, trained to operate together. You just drive around the fort. When you come up against an enemy like Rommel, which is also mobile, who has a mobile force under his hand, who is trained and who has trained his soldiers in all-arms warfare and the integration of all arms, including the Air Force, in their operations, you suddenly find that your use of armour in the way you used to use cavalry, and the independent use of armour and the independent use of infantry, it doesn't work, because you're suddenly up against a master tactician. And you suddenly realise you have an army where they're not trained properly to operate in a combined arms environment. And when I say combined arms, I mean the use of air power as well in this context.
On May the 26th, Rommel launched his attack on the Gazala line. At the same time, an attempt was made to outmaneuver the southern flank at Bir Hakeim. Here, the Afrika Korps ran into tough opposition from British armour, whose firepower had been improved by the arrival of the American-built Grant tank.
The presence in the Middle East of the American General Grant tanks was kept a close secret.
The Grant was twice as fast and had double the range of the Matilda, which had been Britain's main heavy tank. Its 75mm gun was also much more powerful, but its main gun was mounted in a pontoon on the side, which meant that it couldn't easily be traversed, limiting its potential on the battlefield. Although the Axis attack at Gazala and Bir Hakeim was being held, British armour was being deployed piecemeal with little or no coordination between infantry and armoured brigades. But Rommel was also experiencing problems. British armour concentrated in the Knightsbridge box meant that Rommel was dangerously close to being separated from his supply trucks at Bir Hamat. Conventional thinking would have made Rommel pull back to protect his logistical tail, but instead he renewed his attack on the 28th, pushing past Knightsbridge towards El Adem. A determined counterattack by British armour failed to break the Afrika Korps. By nightfall on May the 29th, the Axis armour was beginning to concentrate in an area some 5 miles southwest of Knightsbridge called the Cauldron. This shallow depression was the scene of some of the most desperate fighting on June the 5th, as British forces mounted yet another counterattack using infantry, armour and artillery. The Afrika Korps was almost encircled, and their supplies were stretched. Initially, things went well for the British, but once again, coordination between infantry and armour broke down. Also, British artillery fire, normally so devastating, had failed to make any significant impact on the Axis forces as they were further to the west than had been thought. Confusion reigned, and the initiative passed to the Axis. By nightfall on June the 6th, the cauldron was lit by the fires of over 200 burning British tanks. The 8th Army had also lost an infantry brigade and 4 artillery regiments. One of the regiments, all but wiped out on that day, was the 107th Field Regiment of the Royal Horse Artillery, the South Notts Hussars. Ordered to fight to the last round, Sergeant Ray Ellis did just that.
The Battle of Knightsbridge, of course, there's no such place as Knightsbridge. Knightsbridge is a spot in the desert which the British Army christened Knightsbridge. There's nothing there. It's a saucer which later became known as the Cauldron. We moved into that after firing a terrific barrage on the 5th of June, but I ought to say that we'd lost a lot of men just before that in the battles which still could be called the Battle of Knightsbridge, and B Troop, which held most of my friends because I'd been a long time in B Troop, were wiped out on the 27th of May, and I lost there a lot of friends. I was then in A Troop and the sergeant in charge of a gun. We moved in on the 6th of June for this last battle, and we were told not to move any uniform or boots or anything the night before, to stay fully dressed. We fired a barrage and advanced, but we found that the Germans were not there, they'd retreated. And we advanced right into a trap, right into the cauldron. We topped a ridge and ran into shell fire. And I was standing up in my gun tower with shells bursting all around us, and we drove through it. This terrific shell fire, it was airburst HEs, 88s, everything. By this time dawn was breaking, and we spent the rest of that day fighting in this cauldron. But this time there's no talk of last men and last rounds and so on. It was just normal battle. And then we went to sleep that night, and as I say, we were told not to. Not. I woke early in the morning, before dawn, and 2 officers came across to me. Graham Slynn, who was a fine officer, one of our officers, MC and Bar, grand young chap as he was then, and he said, "We've had an order, Sergeant, we've got to fight to the last man in the last round." "Oh my God," I said, "not to retire." "Oh," he said, "don't think many of us are going to see the sunset today, Sergeant." And the man who was with him, Timms, who was all, he said, "Ought we to be saying this?" And Captain Slynn said, "Sergeant Ellis has been in this as long as we have. We're all in it together." And they moved away, and I said, "Good luck, sir." He said, "Good luck to you, Sergeant." And a few hours later, they were both dead. The Germans attacked, and we took them on open sights with 25-pounders. And fighting tanks with a 25-pounder is not a happy situation, because a 25-pounder is not an anti-tank gun, a gun howitzer. You've no protection, it isn't a good anti-tank gun. But there was nothing else, so we had to do it. And they came, and we fought them off, and they retired, and they came again, and we fought them off and retired. Their heavy artillery opened up on us, Stukas opened up on us, well, we died bombing them. And it was at 10 o'clock when they were making an attack, we were fighting, and I got a direct hit from an 88mm on my gun. I didn't know at that moment that I had. All I knew was I was spinning in the air. I didn't hear anything. I was just spinning in the air, and I hit the ground, and we got another one, probably from the same gun, and I went up again, twice. And when I came down. I think I was unconscious. When I came, I don't remember, it was very hazy, but I came round, the gun was upside down, and I was all black and blood here and there and so on. And my gun crew were lying around, and I moved, and I could move. I found I was all right. I was kneeling for a while, and then I crawled round the gun crew. Some were obviously dead, but I ascertained that they were all dead, but myself lost a lot. And so I crawled behind the gun and tried to build a few rocks around myself, and the battle was still going on. And then I looked at the front. My gun had gone. That left 3 guns in the troop. When there was an airburst over number 1 gun, that's an airburst, is a shell that bursts over in the air. It came down and killed the crew. They all fell and no one moved. I realised that was 2 guns gone out of the troop. And so I crawled over to number 1 gun, which the tyres were all flat. The shield was all riddled. It was in terrible, but it was still work. And men crawled forward, and I fought that gun then, for the rest of the day, in fact. And I lost so many men on that gun. How I lived was a miracle. But as men fell, others came forward, and they were not all artillerymen. They were coming from anywhere. I can remember one was a Royal Corps of Signals. And as long as there was somebody there who knew how to work a gun, as I did, and I fought that gun until the end, and it was the last gun in the regiment to fire, as it happened. And at 6 o'clock at night, there were 2 of us left, myself and a man who I'd never seen in my life before. I was on the left of the gun doing the laying, and he was in the front helping to load the shell. And suddenly I heard a machine gun firing just behind me. They'd come round us. And he was just washed into the shield. He fell, and I braced myself for mine, and I'll never know, will I? I'll never know whether the German gunner had compassion or ran out of ammunition or something else. I like to think it was the first, that everything was finished, the guns were all, and I hope he thought, no. And because of that, I'm still alive. And that was it. The regiment was wiped out. It ceased to exist, and I was a prisoner.
Rommel's victory at the Cauldron now gave him the strength he needed to press home the offensive. His supply routes were secure, and although tired by the speed and piecemeal nature of the fighting, the confidence of the Afrika Korps couldn't have been higher. The 8th Army, by contrast, was shattered. The infantry morale, having taken yet another hammering, began to look distrustfully at their armour. Rommel now turned his attention towards Bir Hakeim, defended by Free French forces. For 10 days, the French withstood ferocious attacks, but they couldn't hold out forever. No attempt was made by the British to reinforce this vital position, and so it fell, leaving the way clear for Rommel to roll up the British defensive line. Tobruk once more faced the prospect of being besieged, but it was not to be. The Navy had made it clear that it was unable to conduct the kind of resupply operations it had carried out in 1941. Auchinleck had also made it clear to Ritchie that he expected the 8th Army to hold a line that would prevent the port from falling. As a result, Tobruk's defences had been allowed to fall into disrepair. In June 1942, Tobruk's survival depended on strong support from a force operating in the area of El Adem and Belhamed. But the final action of the Gazala battles saw 90 British tanks charging into action against 2 panzer divisions of the Afrika Korps. Over 30 tanks were lost in this desperate action, and on June the 18th, Tobruk was surrounded. This time, Tobruk held out for less than 24 hours. At 6 a.m. on June the 21st, the garrison surrendered. 32,000 prisoners, of whom 19,000 were British, passed into Axis hands.
I think my father believed that the fall of Tobruk was the greatest success he had in his military life. After Alamein, my father had no more victorious event.
Took Tobruk in 2 days, and that nearly broke our hearts. When we thought of all the time we'd been in, all the holes we'd dug and everything, all the battles we'd fought there, and in 2 days it was gone.
All the prisoners were starved because the Italians hadn't got any food. The Germans captured us, and they had to, by their own convention, to hand us over as prisoners to the Italians. The Germans did the fighting, the Italians did looking after prisoners and, of course, fighting, but we had to go to the Italians for protection as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. But we were treated very badly as regards to billets. We had no billets, we slept rough, and we had very little food.
We hung around here till almost the last minute. We got out by the skin of our teeth. The old man said, there's a 3-mile gap and we're going out, we're not going in the bag. He said straight out to us, we're not going in the bag. And we drove all night and got back quite near the border and pulled off the road, cut well off the road because you were a sitting target on the road for aircraft. Pulled well off the road and had a meal, rested for a couple of hours, and then 2 of the lads went out to get the day's rations. Came back to the unit and said the ration dump's completely deserted. There's millions and millions of things there, cigarettes, everything.
The fall of Tobruk was a terrible blow to British morale. Churchill was in America and was given the news by President Roosevelt in the White House. He declared himself the most unhappy Englishman in America since Cornwallis at Georgetown. One beneficial side effect was that Roosevelt authorized the immediate release of 300 Sherman tanks. Although it may not have seen it at the time, the Sherman would play a crucial part in the final phase of the war in North Africa.
Fire!
Rommel's capture of Tobruk was rewarded with promotion to Field Marshal. It seems that Tobruk had enthralled Hitler as much as it had Churchill. British forces now withdrew to Mersa Matruh, where a new defensive line had been planned. But with an exposed southern flank and insufficient armour to prevent such an outflanking manoeuvre, it was likely that the rout of Gazala would be repeated. Ritchie had determined that there would be no more retreating, that they would fight here or die.
We were on the top of the pass, and we were tail end Charlies, being the Royal Engineers, and we came down that pass late one evening and blew, I think, 2 of the corners off. Okay? Just hoping there weren't too many of our own lads stuck behind us, but I think we'd waited there all day, waiting, and 5 of our lads had been taken prisoner just before all this happened, and we didn't delay any longer. So it was a question of down, blow, and gently go back. No panic, just, doing a job, and that was it. And we drove through the night, hoping that weren't too many lads, as I say, left behind.
But for Ritchie, there was to be no last stand. Auchinleck flew up from Cairo and took over direct command of the 8th Army as he'd done the year before. He had already decided that there would be a withdrawal to El Alamein. El Alamein was chosen because it's only 80 miles from the coast to the Katara Depression, which is the great sand sea through which vehicles could not pass. Although defences had been prepared, the 8th Army had retreated in some disarray and was totally demoralized. The challenge for Auchinleck was to galvanize this force to stop Rommel in his tracks.
It was exacting, tiring. It was the patrol techniques that had been learnt in Tobruk
were readopted, and patrols would go out for 5 miles or something in the night and come back again, run into a newly located place.
On July the 1st, Rommel attacked at El Alamein. For the next 2 weeks, he was to mount repeated attacks in an attempt to annihilate what was left of the 8th Army. Auchinleck had prepared his defences well. His battle plan was that the army should hold key positions at El Alamein, Rawayazat Ridge, and just to the north of the Qattara Depression. This would then channel any enemy advance. The rest of the army was to remain as mobile as possible in order to hit the flank and rear of any attack. As the Afrika Korps was repeatedly thrown back, the 8th Army began attacking Italian positions where it was felt morale was weak due to poor leadership and stretched supply lines. By the middle of the month, the equivalent of 2 Italian divisions had been removed from Rommel's order of battle. But poor coordination between armour and infantry meant that the 8th Army was unable to drive home any advantage it had won. Churchill, alarmed by what was perceived as a total lack of progress, flew out to Cairo to see for himself. It was a pivotal moment. Churchill made up his mind that the Middle East land forces needed some new blood. Auchinleck was removed as Commander-in-Chief Middle East and replaced by General Sir Harold Alexander. General Bernard Montgomery was appointed to take command of the 8th Army.
I think it was difficult, but he was determined. He'd been waiting for this opportunity probably all his career. And when it came, he was determined to grasp it with every possible talent in his command. And so what he did was to, within 3 weeks of his arrival, the Battle of Aleppo took place, and then he had time to prepare the troops, train them, and get everything ready for the offensive action, and build up the supply of men and material which was needed if this was going to be a successful offensive. But of course the Battle of Alamein itself was a very tough battle, and he was under no delusions that the talent and the capacity and the ability of the German army was very considerable. He always had a huge respect, not only for the German generals, but for the German troops.
When Montgomery arrived in Cairo to start the process of taking over the 8th Army, he and Alexander went to lunch to discuss the way ahead. And Alexander's remit to him was very simple. I want you to throw Rommel out of Africa. Montgomery said, will you give me a completely free hand? The answer was yes. Will you give me all the resources I require? The answer was yes. Unequivocally yes, in both cases. So Montgomery had his objective. He had the total support of the man who told him to achieve that objective, and he went away and did it. And that relationship never changed. When Montgomery said he wanted something because he needed it, Alexander said yes. How he retained his patience, Alexander I mean, with some of the things that Montgomery would get up to, where he would interfere in things that were none of his business, I really don't know. But he himself managed to keep that clarity of thought, which allowed him to separate the trivia of some of the things that Montgomery did from the objective he'd given to the man, and to ensure that he had the support that he required to achieve it. The length of time he needed to train people to use these new Sherman tanks that arrived, the length of time he needed to get his stocks forward, the length of time he needed to get his repair effort in place so that he could ensure that the tanks he was training with were going to be fit and ready to go to war, and that when they broke down or when they were damaged, they would be properly repaired and put back into the battle as fast as possible.
A new era was about to begin, and the stage set for the showdown between two of the greatest commanders of the 20th century. Both had gained their first experience of battle during the carnage of the First World War.
He made two big lessons. One was that he was horrified by the carnage of the First World War, and he was determined, for which he was criticized for being cautious, that you couldn't avoid casualties in war, but the important thing was to keep them to the minimum commensurate with achieving the objective. And the second lesson he learned, because when he was a staff officer, and when he was indeed in the trenches himself, he never saw any generals or knew what was going on. So he was determined, when he became to high command, that every single person should know what his job was and what his duty was, and how he saw and then what the outcome would be. So morale was he considered was a very big battle-winning factor.
It was very similar to Field Marshal Montgomery's experience. He thought that too many staff officers were too far behind and never experienced themselves the sufferings they asked from the soldiers. And my father was 3 times wounded in the First War, the Second War 2 times, and he believed that it's necessary that a general shares also the dangers of the soldiers.
His great quality was this ability to see with great clarity and great simplicity what needed to be done, and then communicate that at every level throughout the organization, so that when he'd finished, not only did everybody understand what he wanted to do, they believed that they needed to do it, and they believed in their ability to do it, and they believed in his ability to lead them to do it. It's just this purity, this clarity of thought, this pure objectivity that he had, and this ability to communicate it. He was a showman par excellence, but he won wars.
Montgomery faced his first taste of desert battle on July the 1st when Rommel struck again, this time at Alam Halfa. Rommel's plan was to fight another Gazala, a feinting frontal attack accompanied by a forceful attack on the enemy's flanks, hitting his lightly defended rear and supply areas. But Montgomery was ready for him. By drawing Rommel in at Alam Halfa, Montgomery was hoping to destroy his armor by attacking it on 3 sides.
Our 4 anti-tank guns were set out in front with orders not to open fire above 300 yards. Fortunately, the first German tank stopped approximately 300 yards for us, and therefore was a sit-in duck. The battle raged on for many hours. I think we knocked out about 18 tanks, but were then overrun, and consequently we were under fire from both the Germans and the artillery barrage from our own people. So we had to crouch down in the pit, wait for nightfall, and were then managed to scramble back and take our gun back to our own lines.
The Western Desert Air Force was also to experience the benefits of Montgomery's approach to business.
And this was Montgomery's first great success. When he arrived at his headquarters, found this flea-ridden, fly-ridden mess parked somewhere in the middle of the North African desert, and his first question was, would somebody please tell me where the Desert Air Force is so I can go and join it? He didn't quite put it like that, but that's what he went to do, and he sat alongside them, and from that day on, you only have to look at the impact the Desert Air Force had on Montgomery's first great battle at Alam Halfa. At night, he bombed the German tank concentrations, and he used the Air Force to start the process of crumbling down, grinding down the Germans from the very, very outset. And I think Rommel has written how surprised he was and how much damage was done by the Allied air forces. And in fact, I think I'm right in saying it was the damage caused by the Allied air attacks on Rommel on that first night of Alam Halfa that caused him to pause and think twice about whether or not he would pursue the attack, and caused him to turn his tack, not from going along the valley along in the direction of Cairo, but actually to turn left onto the Alam Halfa ridge to try and break it down, because he could see that's where the threat was going to come from, and he realized that it was much more of a bastion than he thought it was going to be, and it caused him to pause for thought. And indeed, there are some who say that against his better judgment he continued the attack on Alam Halfa, when his instinct said that he should withdraw and fight another day because of the damage that had been done already by the Air Force-Army cooperation, and which he could see continuing. I think probably at that stage, the attack of the Desert Air Force on his advance made him realize for the first time there was a different man in charge.
Brook, which was quite a long way in 7 or 8 hours, dropping 500-pound bombs on the harbour, and a lot well defended. I don't know how many guns they had, but there seemed to be a lot more, and they had, I'd say, about 5 or 10 searchlights, and I remember those very well because the thing that, the way the searchlight works, apparently they'd all go out and there'd be one blue beam left. And nothing had happened for about 10 seconds, then they'd all come on together, targeted on one aeroplane, and you just wondered whether you might be the one they targeted on. And we couldn't get great height, unfortunately, with Wellington because of the, I suppose, the bomb load and the thin air of the desert, but you were lucky to get a bit above 10,000 feet. And if you got caught in the searchlights, you found taking evasive action, you lost a lot of height, and as a result of that, you got down to 5,000 to 6,000 feet when the light flak came up at you. But that's only if you were lucky enough or unlucky enough to get beamed by the searchlights. And then it was a long, long way home, and you found after you had gone into the target that you were a bit worn out and dry in the mouth, and you, coming home, you generally handed over to the second pilot for some other way, and strange to say, you dropped off to sleep with a completely worn out. I don't know why that should be, because we were young and active and reasonably fit, I think.
During the early months of 1942, the Western Desert Air Force had been reinforced by the arrival of significant numbers of new aircraft types. The bomber force had been strengthened by the arrival of the Mark 10 Wellington, which had a greater range and had more reliable engines. The arrival of large numbers of American-built Douglas Bostons also greatly enhanced the RAF's striking power. The fighter force had also been dramatically improved. The Hurricane, although more or less retired from European operations, found a new lease of life in the Western Desert. The addition of 4 cannons under its wings made the Hurricane very useful indeed in attacking armour. Spitfire Mark Vs also began arriving, equipped with a special cowling designed to keep the dust and sand out of the engine. The Spitfires and Hurricanes were complemented by American-built Kitty Hawks. The Kitty Hawk's toughness and reliability made it the ideal weapon in the desert's hostile environment. The defeat of Rommel at Alam Halfa restored some of the 8th Army's lost confidence.
I think the confidence grew, now you believe this or not, when Montgomery took over. For the first time, we really knew what was going on. He got some leaflets printed saying, we stop here, we don't fall back any further. And as I say, what is termed as the first Battle of Alamein, that was at Alam Halfa and Kidney Ridge, when they were stopped. We began to think, well, he told us we'd stop them, and we did, and it gave us confidence.
But there was still much to be done before Montgomery could consider mounting his first offensive. For the next 6 weeks, the soldiers were put through a rigorous program of training, and yet more training.
So it's not until Montgomery comes along and he realizes that although he has an experienced army on his hands in the shape of the 8th Army, he has an army which is untrained and has not been trained in combined arms operations. And there are loads of examples, if you read through any of the history books and talk to any of the people there, about the failure to understand, to comprehend the combined arms approach to the conduct of operations. You suddenly realize that actually we weren't we hadn't become stodgy. We always were, because we hadn't trained in a combined arms environment, and suddenly along comes this man, this genius, who has a very simple, clear vision of what he wants to achieve and how to achieve it. He develops his plan for the conduct of the operation, which will win, because he's determined that he will. And he trains his army to achieve his plan. And in training them, he brings in this combined arms approach, which he wasn't able totally successfully to inculcate into the 8th Army by the time of Alamein, which is why some of the problems arose during the battle. But nonetheless, he'd inculcated enough of it for victory to be the final outcome in what was essentially, I think, more of a slogging match than he wanted, but nonetheless was forced on him by the state that the 8th Army was in. And here I'm not talking about the quality and the courage of individual soldiers, not for one second. I'm talking about the fact that they weren't trained to operate as a team. And if you read Montgomery and about Montgomery, that word team keeps coming through in I know it's overused in modern management speak, but he uses it all the time. And the 8th Army wasn't a team. The Afrika Korps was. And if you're going to take on a team, you can only do it with a team that's better. You can't do it with a group of individuals. And in a sense, that's what he had in the 8th Army, not just a group of individual people, but individual organizations which tended to operate independently. And they didn't understand each other's capabilities. I don't think it was helped by the fact that the Matilda was called an infantry tank. Well, that kind of flies in the face of, what does an infantry tank do? No, sorry, let's go back to basics and start talking about the proper use of armour, infantry and artillery together in a combined operation, logistically supported by mobile logistic stocks which can actually replenish the battle you want to fight in the way you want to fight it, and the use of air power on top of all that and alongside it and around it to deliver you the superiority you need, the umbrella you need, under which to conduct those operations effectively.
We became very proficient as a unit. It's different from just company training where you might be very proficient, but it's better if you've got the whole lot going and the CO tells you and everybody gets into the mood that what he tells you, you do. And we evolved that attitude very clearly. We were a bit pleased to perhaps join in the fray and resentful of the South Africans having lost Tobruk. There was a pride in going into the great diversity of people who were in a challenge in 8th Army.
New equipment was arriving in large quantities, including at last a 6-pounder anti-tank gun capable of doing the job. The Sherman tank also arrived. Again, the British now had a tank with a gun which at 75mm was capable of knocking out German armour. It was also reasonably fast and had better armour than its predecessors. The Sherman's all-round capability meant that it was to become the Allies' most widely used tank of the war.
We had learnt a lot of lessons. We learned how to retreat quite well, actually. But they got to the stage where I think the higher-ups had thought, right, if we don't break in this time, we're going to be here forever. And by then we'd got a bit more equipment. The Yanks were in the war. They were pouring tanks in, Stuarts and Grants and Shermans. And we had the upper hand, literally. Because before that we were the sort of underdogs. Because you see, they could manufacture things in Germany, ship it into northern Italy in about 3 days, down through Italy, 2 or 3 days across the Med, and very, within about 2 weeks of leaving a factory in Germany, it could be here. Whereas ours had to go around the Cape, you're talking about 8 weeks. Longer than that very often.
But as Montgomery's battle plan developed, it became clear that only a frontal assault would be feasible. And so, on the night of October the 23rd, Operation Lightfoot, the Battle of El Alamein, began. Nearly 1,000 guns opened up with a barrage that took the Axis forces by surprise.
We were waiting, we knew how to attack that night, and we knew it was going to be at 10 o'clock, and we were all waiting to go. And then all of a sudden, on 20 minutes to 10, all the horizon just lit up. It was fantastic. You couldn't describe what it was like. And then as one lot fired, then the next lot was firing, and it was, goodness me. And then there was a big whistle overhead as the shells were going over, like a very high wind or a big flock of birds or something, and then the crash just as they landed, and explosions, of course, the noise came from the guns. And then the Germans started to fire. It was a real bedlam. It was, it sort of burst your eardrums, and it kept on going. And then, of course, at 10 o'clock, we stepped off and away we went.
Kept you awake. It was rather noisy. And well, really, you knew what was coming, so you couldn't go to sleep anyway, so the noise wasn't going to disturb you. You were just sitting there waiting to go in. You knew what was coming, and you all became an instant Christian and said your prayers.
Then when the time come and the moon come up and the hell broke loose, and it did, the whole sky was red. There's 908 guns opened up at a split second. And the boys was all waiting to go in. They're right amongst us, you see. And because we've locked in the actual front position. And away they went, and the 51st Highland Division, they went in on the left with the pipes blowing all the way in.
As the barrage continued, engineers moved forward to clear lanes through the minefields using white tape and coloured lanterns as markers.
Well, the thing that struck me, there was no panic. The men we had trained, we'd had, I think, at least 2 nights further back, we laid out a dummy minefield on our own. Oh, well back, down near Waddy-na-Troon, I think it was called. We laid out the thing. Somebody put dummy mines down while we were still back at camp. During the day, they put these dummy mines down, and then we had to find them, and you called it gapping. You had to put angle iron pickets in, and they had bicycle lamps with a hood on it, facing back this way, so the tanks would come along and follow the lights through. But by the time it was dawn, not many tanks had got through, because we were delayed quite dramatically, and there was no point in putting tanks through in broad daylight. In the meantime, a friend of mine, Roy Gray, was a corporal and an officer, went out in the dark, and just over this rise there was a burnt out armoured car, and they walked and counted their paces until they came to the German wire, so that they knew on the night of the 23rd how far they had to go. In the meantime, to actually find the mines, we had stripped down a vehicle completely, cab off everything, sandbagged the back, had a Heath Robinson traction put in the back like a round drum, made of mild steel, with a couple of rods going on a lever to the accelerator, basically the accelerator, and to be able to steer it. What do they call those blasted things? Tillers. Anyway, when the time came, this corporal started this thing up and he just drove it. At the same time, laying a tape out behind him, rolling off, so that people following up knew they followed that tape. And he had to drive that until he hit a mine. And he hit the mine, so then we knew where to start. So we went to worked to the left and to the right until we gradually clear it up. And then one party found the mines, another party disarmed them and sort of put them to one side. And about just before dawn, we had our first vehicles went through.
A feinting attack was mounted to the south in order to fool Rommel into believing that this was the main attack. But it was in the far north that the main thrust was to take place.
We thought then that with all that artillery fire, it'd be just a walkover. We thought there couldn't possibly be anybody still alive, that they could have sort of stood all that and still been able to get up and fight. And so we kept as close as we could to the artillery fire, so as they were, when we got to them we thought they'd still be shell-shocked and they wouldn't get up, but they soon pulled themselves together and started to fire back. And it was pretty rough going that first night, and we didn't get our objective. We got sent, and we lost all our officers to our captain, that's our company commander, and our platoon commanders and platoon sergeants were all killed within the first hour.
In the weeks leading up to the attack, the battle plan had been revised, following the realization that the Axis weak points lay where the Italian and German forces overlapped. It was at these points that the most intense attacks were to be directed.
He was always, as an army commander, he would always be trying to find the junction point between the Italians and the Germans, not necessarily because the Italians were weaker than the Germans, although that was the case here, but because any army commander will try and find that junction point, because it is inevitably a weak point in the opposition's defences. But I don't think it was in his original plan. The reason he had to change to attack that weak link and to try and work his way around the back of the Germans the way he did was the fact that the armour of 10th Corps had failed in reaching its initial objectives and had taken far too long to reach its initial objectives because of the way it was commanded and led. It didn't seem to have the oomph behind it that Montgomery wanted to be put behind it, and so consequently he was faced not only with changing his main plan for Operation Lightfoot on the 6th of October, because he couldn't use 10th Corps as a corps de chasse as he had planned, but also then subsequently to adjust his planning, but then no plan survives first contact with the enemy, so he'd have had to adjust something anyway, but to adjust his planning to take account of the fact that all had not gone as he had expected due to the failure of the 1st Division and the 10th Division from 10th Corps to break through in the north with the speed and to the distance that he had anticipated and planned upon.
Meanwhile, the Australian 9th Division was making good progress at the northern tip of the line.
First time we attacked, the tanks couldn't get up to us because of the minefields. So we attacked without the tanks, but of course they drove us back. And we formed up and went again, and they cleared a gap in the minefields, and our tanks got through, and away we went, and well, we're going very well indeed. In fact, there was just a thin line of grey and they were running. And we were firing as fast as we could, of course. And then one of our tanks went over a mine and was ablaze, and we all silhouetted, and whether they got to their second line of defence and turned and gave us a little bit of a workout at that stage. And we went down, of course, and all those traces were coming at us, and I swear every one of those traces was heading straight for me.
But the Allies were becoming bogged down in endless attacks and counterattacks. Casualties were mounting too.
The trouble started after that. Jerry got a bit mad with us. He started counterattacking. And it was about the third night, I think, that he broke through near the railway line on the road. And they sent our sister battalion in 2nd 28, and they were all taken prisoners of war in 2 hours. So they sent us in the dark, and A company was on our right and we was on the centre, and another company behind, and one company, so all 3 forwards and 1 reserve. So they said to the A company, said, if you get cut off, go back to the blockhouse, which was the old railway station. So one of our chaps, well, more than one got cut off, but one guy could see the blockhouse, so he scrambled away, because some lay there till morning and then crawled back to the station. So he goes back to the blockhouse, and when he gets there, there's a German, either a sergeant or an officer saying, he said, all the Shermans to my left, and all your horse Australians to my right. He starts walking straight into the German lines. You see, they had the southern end of the blockhouse, and we had the northern end. We changed places, because they'd broken right through. Now, they had all the high ground on us, and it took us nights and days to clear it.
Then Rommel ordered his panzers northwards to help his beleaguered infantry. On November the 1st, the battle entered its final phase as the Allies mounted an attack on the Panzer's southern flank. With the Panzer divisions drawn into battle, the way was clear for the Allied armoured divisions in the north. Codenamed Supercharged, this phase was so successful that Rommel cabled Hitler seeking permission to withdraw. His request was denied. But as his losses mounted, an increasingly disillusioned Rommel once again requested permission to withdraw. This time his request was granted.
He became disillusioned because it was clear to him that the Germans will be defeated after Alamein. He saw the German advance to Alamein or to Egypt as a last chance to be successful in Africa, and afterward he had no hope left. And of course, he found out more and more what really happened in Germany and in Russia. And today we all know it was better to be defeated than to be victorious with Hitler.
In Britain, El Alamein was greeted as a great victory. For the first time since the war began, the church bells rang in celebration. In Churchill's mind, the victory heralded a new chapter in the war.
We have victory. A remarkable and definite victory. A bright gleam has caught the helmets of our soldiers and warmed and cheered all our hearts. The late Monsieur Venizelos observed that in all our wars, England, you ought to have said Britain, of course, England always wins one battle, the last. We seem to have begun rather earlier this time. General Alexander with his brilliant comrade and lieutenant, General Montgomery, has gained a glorious and decisive victory in what I think should be called the Battle of Egypt. Rommel's army has been defeated. It has been routed. It has been very largely destroyed as a fighting force. The Italians were left to perish in the waterless desert or surrender, as they are doing by tens of thousands. Germans have received back again that measure of fire and steel which they have so often meted out to others. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
As Rommel's forces began streaming westwards, events in North Africa took a new turn. On November the 8th, an Anglo-American force launched a series of landings with the objective of seizing Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Operation Torch began with American assaults at Casablanca and Oran, while a combined force of American and British troops attacked Algiers.
What did the Americans learn from Torch? Can we go back a bit on Torch and talk about why it might have happened in the first place? We have to take account of the Russians, who were extraordinarily disappointed that we were not prepared to open up a second front in 1942, as soon as Hitler started the invasion of Russia. And something had to be done. Now, at that stage, the United Kingdom was not enough of a launching platform for France, and France was too well and too heavily defended by considerable German forces. You had in Churchill a Prime Minister who had always been fascinated by the soft underbelly of Europe, and so therefore could see the value potentially of attacking the Axis powers through the soft underbelly, particularly given the weakness of the Italians, the Italian government, the Italian army, the Italian armed forces. And it was a very good first step as a means of attacking Fortress Europe. Given Churchill's vision, he could almost certainly also see that if they tied the German army down in Italy, they couldn't be redeployed to help out in Normandy, and so therefore he was opening his own mini second front in order to ensure that he made the Germans look in as many directions as possible, so as to weaken them as much as he could in Normandy. So I think it was many things, and not the least of which was a first attempt at some sort of American-British cooperation in the conduct of an operation which, if successful, would divert German resources, although probably not shorten the war greatly. And if unsuccessful, there wasn't a huge amount to be lost in terms of the security of the United Kingdom home base.
On November the 11th, Algiers signed an armistice. The next target was Tunisia. If Tunisia were to fall, then Rommel would find himself wedged between Allied forces to the west and east. For the newly formed First Army, the attack on Tunisia was not going to be easy. There were few roads and maps were poor. Also, there was little information about the enemy's dispositions. The hilly terrain very much favored the defense, as the advance on Bizerta and Tunis slowed in the face of repeated counterattacks. The Germans were flooding the region with reinforcements from Italy and Sicily, while British and American supply lines became increasingly stretched the further east they advanced. However, although it was the first time in combat for British and American troops of the First Army, they acquitted themselves well. 2 years of intense training were beginning to pay off. But First Army was a disparate force, and there were the inevitable frictions. The Americans viewed their British counterparts as blue-eyed, pipe-smoking bastards with an elegant manner and no manners at all. They resented the British soldiers' superior attitude, born of having been at war for over 2 years longer. To the British, the Americans were brash amateurs with too much kit, but very little idea of how to use it. Events in February only served to reinforce this view. Meanwhile, the 8th Army pursued Rommel westwards. At one point near Mersa Matruh, they nearly had him, but heavy rain intervened and Rommel slipped away. His retreat orderly and disciplined, ever ready to seize an opportunity despite being outnumbered. Montgomery, on the other hand, was cautious and refused to be hurried. He would fight this campaign on his terms and on his terms alone.
Rommel conducted a classic withdrawal in contact with the enemy, which is the hardest of all military operations to conduct, and he did it well. And Montgomery's been condemned by many for not following it up. I think we need to understand certain basic facts. And I come back to the point about the state of training of the 8th Army. They were not trained in the pursuit. They didn't have the communications in place, and they didn't have the all-arms infrastructure in place to conduct an effective pursuit. And you recall that Montgomery had been increasingly disappointed with his armoured commanders, caused him to change his plan, caused him yet again to change his plans as the battle was going forward because they were not addressing issues in the way that he wanted them addressed. Indeed, on the verge of insubordination in the failure to translate their orders into operational action, in failure to translate his orders into operational action. He knew that the 8th Army couldn't do it, not that it wouldn't do it. And his great concern, I suspect, although I'm not in his mind, was that he would turn a victory for himself into a victory for Rommel. Even if it wasn't a defeat for Montgomery, he'd turn it into a moral victory for Rommel if he sent untrained armour chasing after an enemy that could then turn and smack it on the nose very hard indeed. Just once was all that would be needed. It would do nothing for the morale of the British Army, nothing for their allies, nothing for the very dented morale of the armoured corps out there. What he had on his hands at the end of Alamein was a complete victory. The army with its tails up. He'd learned an awful lot of lessons from failures in certain areas. He needed to remedy those before he could move on.
But Field Marshal Montgomery knew very well his victory is certain. There was no need to sacrifice soldiers. The end was to come for the Germans. And my father admired Montgomery because he was a very perfect military thinker. He even wrote to Hitler in one of his letters in 1944, "We must follow the example of Field Marshal Montgomery."
On November the 12th, Tobruk was once again in Allied hands. The port would help shorten the Allies' logistical tail. At El Agheila, it looked as if Rommel might make a stand. There were some within the ranks of the 8th Army who held their breath. They'd been here twice before. But once again, Rommel slipped away. All along the way, sappers and engineers had to search out mines and booby traps left by the retreating Axis forces. Finally, on January the 23rd, Tripoli fell. For Montgomery, the satisfaction of accepting the surrender of Tripolitania from the province's vice-governor was tinged with regret at not having destroyed Rommel's armour. The Italian Empire in North Africa may have come to an end, but there was still some unfinished business to attend to. Axis forces were now regrouping in Tunisia. With the Allied First Army completely bogged down, it was beginning to look as if the 8th Army would have to finish the Germans off in North Africa. But Rommel, realizing that he was at risk of being caught between the two armies, struck first. He launched his attack against the 2nd US Corps at the Kesserine Pass on February the 14th, because he believed the Americans were inexperienced and therefore would be easily beaten. He was nearly proved right, but for a determined counterattack led by British armour and artillery. Then, on February the 16th, the 8th Army entered Tunisia, led by the 7th Armoured Division. Before them lay the Mareth Line, defences built by the French before the war to protect themselves from possible Italian invasion from Libya.
I have just received a message from General Montgomery that the 8th Army is on the move and that he is satisfied with their progress. Let us wish them Godspeed in their struggle, and let us bend all our efforts to the war.
Thanks to decoded messages, Montgomery already knew that Rommel was planning to attack him. On the night of March the 20th, the barrage began. The 50th Northumbrian Division led the attack on the enemy's frontal defences. There was severe fighting as they struggled to get tanks across the Wadi Zigzag, which formed a natural anti-tank ditch. Rommel, fearing another El Alamein, rushed his armour up to counter the threat. At this point, Montgomery decided to shift the emphasis of the main attack to the left flank, which was spearheaded by General Freyberg's New Zealand Division and 1st Armoured Division. With excellent coordination between infantry, armour and air force, the Allies launched their first blitzkrieg attack of the war. Waves of aircraft pounded enemy positions as tanks rolled forward at El Hamad. The attack was completely successful, and the 8th Army was able to cross the Mareth line and head north towards Tunis.
I think by the time we reached the Mareth line, there was a greater understanding of the combined arms concept, and therefore, yes, we had. We'd practiced it that much better, commanders knew each other better, and therefore we were probably better at it. There were still many of the wrinkles in the 8th Army that had existed at Alamein still existed, not the least of which was the personality clashes that existed between some of the divisional commanders and the corps commanders, and between divisions and within corps. And that has an effect on the way operations were conducted. But there's no doubt that it was a much better trained, better practiced army that assaulted the Mareth line, and Montgomery could assault with much greater confidence, despite the fact he had a very long and very tenuous supply line going all the way back along the North African coast, with a degree of confidence, and he knew he was hugely superior in material anyway, and men. But really, I suppose the Mareth line was not so much a case of would he win, it was really a case of showing that he could now conduct the orchestra that he'd built in such a way that casualties were reduced to the bare minimum, because they had become so much more effective together as a collective organ of war than had been the case in the past. Tanks were learning to work with infantry. Infantry were working with artillery. Artillery was working with both. It was much more a cohesive organisation. And of course you had the personality of this man, this amazing man, stamped over it all. His will just permeated through everything.
By the first week of April, the 1st and 8th Armies were able to link up and form a continuous line, hemming in the Axis forces with their backs to the sea. Their symbolic meeting threw up some stark contrasts. The men of the 8th Army came as veterans of 3 years' fighting. Their vehicles were battered and sand-coloured, and their dress almost casual. In contrast, 1st Army vehicles were freshly painted green, and its troops wore formal battle dress. Not surprisingly, then, that there should be some antagonism and rivalry as to who should have the final honours. The final attack, codenamed Vulcan, began on May the 4th. It was launched by the 1st Army, reinforced with Montgomery's 2 veteran divisions, the 4th Indian and 7th Army. By the 13th, it was all over. Bizerta was in American hands and Tunis in British. Over 200,000 German and Italian prisoners were taken, prompting Goebbels to compare the catastrophe with Stalingrad, which had fallen at the beginning of February. General Alexander was able to cable Churchill with the news: "We are masters of the North African shore."
I'm not sure we learned it in the Western Desert. I think the huge difference now is the very high degree of professional training that is given to officers at all levels and across all cap badges, and the total integration which currently exists not only between the teeth arms but with the logistics support that's available as well in a much more integrated approach than was the case there. The combined arms concept, the idea of combined arms, operating together, operating with Air Force, and all of those lessons which seemed so new and original in those days are now just taken for granted. And that, if it was a lesson of the Western Desert or just a gaining of an experience, I'm not entirely sure. But there is no doubt that the huge difference between then and now is professionalism at all levels, not just the individual training, but professionalism at all levels in combined arms operations, in working together, in integrating all aspects of an army's needs to produce the one outcome, which is victory.
Rats of Tobruk, desert rats, by the left, into Tobruk, quick march.
On April the 29th, 2001, the Rats of Tobruk Association lined up for the last time. 60 years earlier, they'd fought for their lives as the garrison was besieged. Although many of those present had gone on to fight in Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the Low Countries, and up to the Baltic, it's along the shores of the southern Mediterranean that the sharpest memories linger.
Desert rats, do your duties, dismiss!